do see a lot of people that are becoming genuinely concerned that Bitcoin is being hijacked by these institutions and larger players.
There's some conspiracy and there's some truth. And I don't know if that's 50-50, 80-20, 60-40, whatever it is.
Maybe this is the long con play for the traditional financial markets to fight back against Bitcoin, because they will effectively end up controlling these miners in the near future. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Proof of Words podcast. I'm, as always, your host, Patrick Lowry, and today with me, we have Aleksandar Svetski. Alex is the author of his new book, Bushido of Bitcoin, as well as one of the founders of Satlantis. Alex, it's a wonderful opportunity to have you on the show, and it's rather serendipitous that we have this opportunity to do this now, as literally as we just started this recording, Bitcoin just crossed $108,000 for the first time. We're doing this recording on Tuesday. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll start diving into everything.
Thank you, Pat, for having me on. And yes, it's I mean, I think these days, over the next 6 months, people are going to be having podcasts on all-time highs almost every week. It'll be hilarious.
As a community, I think we need to start because it was great whenever Bitcoin went up $1,000 when it was trading around 10,000, right? I think we as a community need to accept that we should only get excited when Bitcoin goes up a magnitude of 10, right? Or at least that's something that I'm going to push for, because I get really annoyed when all my friends start celebrating when we hit 105, 106, 107. I'm like, you know what? Can't we just decide that it's only every $10,000 increment that we can start celebrating, you know?
10 would be interesting. I think also maybe the just keeping with round numbers. So it's like the next milestone is 200 and then 300, etc. But yeah, we'll see. It'll be funny how future generations look on this period. Maybe, a couple decades from now, 100 years from now, it'll be like, yeah, we're definitely in the midst of history. It's a fascinating time.
It is, and it seems like obviously one of the biggest catalysts for this it certainly is the Trump election, Donald Trump winning the re-election just a little bit over a month ago. That seems to have been maybe the straw that broke the camel's back and really opened up the Bitcoin floodgates. Obviously, we've appreciated in price about $40,000 since then. And this is obviously on rumors of, well, not really rumors. It's on Donald Trump going out and publicly saying that he wants to have a Bitcoin strategic reserve for the United States government. I mean, do you actually see that as something that can legitimately happen? Because even the betting markets, poly market right now, I think they're only trailing at about like maybe a 25, 30% odds that the Bitcoin strategic reserve does happen.
I mean, I don't know the mechanics of this stuff. I mean, it would make sense if there's a gold reserve. It would make sense, obviously, to have a Bitcoin reserve. Once again, I don't know. The Bitcoin is more designed for individual ownership, just by the nature of the fact that it's a private key, and whoever ends up with access to the private key ends up with access to the Bitcoin, right? So it is much trickier for both institutions and governments. Like, the more stakeholders you have, and also the more stakeholders you represent, the trickier it is. Now, we're humans. We're innovative creatures. We always find a way over, under, around, or through. So I'm sure there'll be solutions for it, and most likely the early solutions will be more like custodial, or they'll operate within the paradigm of how we understood custody up until now. But Bitcoin obviously comes with its own set of primitives, and it's a new paradigm. So we're going to have to think of ways to better do this, particularly when you're talking about an organization as complex as a nation state. So it's but all that being said, it sounds to me like it's something that might happen, and I'm cautiously optimistic, although I don't really have a horse in the race outside of the fact that I want Bitcoin to win, and if this is a pathway there, then all good.
So do you see, I mean, one of the things that I don't want to necessarily say concerns me is, I mean, adoption on an institutional and a nation state level like this, right? It's a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, people that are Bitcoiners like us, I've been working in this industry for about a decade now at this point, since about 2015. Other people have been in long before I have. And on one hand, it's wonderful to see the price appreciation of Bitcoin. And it's wonderful to see nation states starting to have conversations, legitimate conversations about adopting it, not as national reserve currency, which we've already seen Nayib Bukele in El Salvador do, but also adopting it as a strategic reserve. And we don't have to talk about the success of the Bitcoin ETFs earlier this year and what that means for institutional adoption. These were the fastest growing ETFs ever. But it seems as though we're once again running into this trap that Bitcoin is just there to have its price appreciate relative to the dollar. And of course, that is one of the use cases of Bitcoin. It does have that digital gold value, that store of value, right? That is why it's one of the best, it is the best money on earth. But I feel like we're losing, we're kind of losing the plot a little bit. Maybe not the OGs or the real Bitcoiners, but from a mainstream perspective, from a retail and an institutional perspective, the plot seems to be lost. Or am I just overthinking that?
No, I mean, this is the thing. The nature of going mainstream is that the original plot gets lost. I think it's the, if you want to, if you, like, if you want Bitcoin to have the ultimate win, then it has to become mainstream. But the mainstream is fundamentally stupid, retarded, like all those whatever words you want to give it, right? Like the mainstream is the mainstream, right?
Right.
So when it becomes mainstream, we're going to lose, we're going to dilute the original mission. Like people are going to get further and further detached from what that core mission is. I don't know how to solve that. I don't think there is even a solution to that. I think it's just the call it the, it's not the drawback, it's not the word I'm looking for, but the price of winning, right? Is that
That's actually a very fair way to put that, I think. I mean, at the end of the day, everybody that is, I mean, every Bitcoiner wants to see mainstream adoption of this. The truth is that we were never going to see mainstream adoption the way that maybe the original Bitcoiners or even Satoshi anticipated it. 99% of the world does not want to worry about having their own cold storage wallet. They don't want to worry about operating and setting up their own node. They don't want to have to worry about uh, maintaining their seed phrases or their private keys, right? They're comfortable with how the traditional financial ecosystem works because even though it has flaws, for better or for worse, it does work. And that's why Coinbase and other larger crypto institutions have adopted the best practice from traditional financial capital markets, um, because that is how the traditional layperson is familiar with interacting with Bitcoin. And I like the way that you phrase that this is the cost of winning. But I'm not even necessarily sure that it's a cost because, on one hand, you can still, as an individual that is comfortable with technology, that is comfortable with cold storage and operating a node, you can still operate and run Bitcoin the way that it was initially intended. Um, and at the same time still participate in the appreciation of it as an asset relative to I mean it's just purchasing power parity increase for yourself, right? So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but you do see a lot of people that are becoming genuinely concerned that Bitcoin is being hijacked by these institutions and larger players. Do you see this as a risk potentially?
yeah, the hijacking question is a tough one. I mean, the you can't hijack it by how much you hold, and this is where like the argument, like Bitcoin is not proof of stake, it's proof of work,
Right.
right? So that's an important distinction. But yeah, the question then comes is like, can you potentially hijack the proof of work component and transform things? And it's not clear to me that you exactly can. And this is obviously the importance of Bitcoin being as decentralized as possible, for there being multiple node operators, or many thousands of node operators, should I say, many different miners, all this sort of stuff. So all of this stuff matters. Um, is it being hijacked? I think the biggest thing being hijacked now is probably the narrative around Bitcoin,
Mhm.
and narrative does matter because narrative is upstream of everything else. So like it does have an effect on how things operate downstream. Um, but it's also for those who are thinking of in some way, shape, or form hijacking Bitcoin, it's also something that they need to be wary of, because if they are successful in somehow hijacking Bitcoin, then they've defeated the purpose of Bitcoin, and it breaks it for everybody, right? So, um,
So this is where I always wonder, because when you start playing game theory in that regard, there is no true incentive to end up hijacking Bitcoin. There is no theoretical financial upside in controlling
No financial
the
upside. There's no financial upside. There is an upside in making sure that it does fail. Is that the upside is you get to keep playing your central banking Ponzi.
That's very true. At the end of the day, though, that would cost. I wonder how much today it would cost to try to hijack Bitcoin. Let's say you're a nation state hell bent on trying to destroy Bitcoin, so you have to end up controlling the majority of the hash power, right? Factor in the difficulty index or the difficulty adjustment. I mean, it would cost hundreds of billions, if not trillions, to set up the infrastructure from ground zero to get to the point where you could hijack Bitcoin. So I wonder if there isn't even really an incentive to try to
Well, you
make that
wouldn't.
happen.
I don't think you would do it directly like that. I think you would start with hijacking the narrative, and then you would slowly by slowly buy into existing infrastructure instead of starting from zero.
Mm-hmm.
You would not only buy mining infrastructure, but you would make sure you control on ramps, off ramps, and all that sort of stuff. So we may well be midway through a hijacking. I don't know. This isn't like a you you wouldn't do a hijacking head on. It's like make it known. Yep, we're a nation state, and we're gonna buy up all the Bitcoin so that we can change it. That's obviously gonna fail. Like these clandestine operations that occur on the table are probably ongoing, and so there is like the trouble with this stuff is it's always quite complicated.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of truth in what people are saying about Bitcoin being hijacked and this person, that person being a bad actor and all this sort of stuff. There's some conspiracy and there's some truth. And I don't know if that's 50-50, 80-20, 60-40, whatever it is. Like the split is impossible to tell. But
Well, every lie, the best lies are always based on elements of truth. The best conspiracies always have elements of truth to them.
yeah, every joke, yeah, same thing. So I guess that's just my way of saying I don't know what the answer is, and we may be mid um, hijacking. I don't think it's as clear cut. I used to take a more hardline approach. It would cost billions or trillions or whatever to hijack Bitcoin. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe those billions have already been deployed, and we're in the midst of a attempted hijacking. Again, I don't know if that's going to be successful or not, but we don't know, and it's not as clear cut. Like we cannot be as confident as we might seem as Bitcoin's impossible to hijack because maybe it's not.
It would be interesting to see if, because I never really actually considered it like that before, but what you've actually just described sounds a lot like how BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, other large asset managers managing trillions used their influence on the boards of public companies to push DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, through the mainstream, because they basically, and that's exactly how they ended up pushing the woke agenda.
Yeah. You start with the narrative, and then you go downstream from there.
So now that I'm thinking about it, I mean, the biggest risk that you could probably see there is all of these Bitcoin miners, specifically the publicly traded ones out there that are actively raising billions upon billions of dollars to acquire more Bitcoin, to expand their Bitcoin mining facilities, basically becoming meme stocks to a certain extent. And they're raising this money from Vanguard. They're raising this money from Allianz, the very big insurance provider in Germany. We've seen this in multiple instances. I think it was actually Allianz that was the number one subscriber to Michael Saylor's most recent Bitcoin bond. So, on one hand, you could see that this is definitely one way that these groups are able to acquire more Bitcoin and extend their Bitcoin mining facilities. But maybe through these financial institutions getting more control over these entities through these convertible notes, which will be equity holding, they will be shares one day. Maybe this is the long con play for the traditional financial markets to fight back against Bitcoin, because they will effectively end up controlling these miners in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfectly valid approach. Like if you were to again put your game theory hat on, that would be something you might want to do. That is an approach. And again, the thing is, what's tricky about this? It's also just purely an approach that makes a lot of financial sense, right? So it's an approach for both, and it's very hard to determine whether it's a sound economic decision or if it's a conspiracy to hijack. And there's no reason why it can't be both as well, which makes it even more difficult. So we don't know, and I don't know what to do about that. Um, it's very tricky.
Yeah, it's a scary thought because maybe I'd been thinking about that a little too simply, but the way that you framed it there and where we kind of arrived with that conversation, it really does paint a potentially gloomy picture. I hope that it doesn't end up working out like that. I don't think that it will. I would hope that they are purely financially incentivized for this and operating in good faith. But as with every large government institution, that always gets called into question sooner or later. So we kind of got even sidetracked off from the very beginning there. And that was a wonderful tangent to go on. But I mean, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was your book, The Bushido of Bitcoin. I don't even know what the word Bushido means, if I'm going to be completely honest. So maybe if you could tell me a little bit about what your book is about and I mean, why somebody like myself should pick it up and try to read through.
Yeah, so the word itself means way of the warrior, and the closest Western equivalent you could think of is like chivalry. So it's basically a moral code, or a code of virtue, more accurately. Which, if you think about what the word virtue means, is kind of
Mm-hmm.
some blend of principle and behavior, right? So it's like it's a way of being, it's a way of acting, it's a way of living. And the Bushido was the code of virtue for the samurai in the feudal period of Japan. So what you had this warrior class that after the big battle of Sekigahara and the unification of Japan, sort of found themselves without a battle to fight, without a war to wage,
Mm-hmm.
and they were the class that led Japan to unification, all this sort of stuff. They were the protector class as well. They were the warrior class, and they needed to direct that energy, that virility in some direction. So they basically, I mean, Bushido sort of somewhat informally existed for hundreds of years prior to that. It was the way the warrior would act on the battlefield. So, like,
Mm-hmm.
with virtue like honor and integrity and of courage, etc. Right, but it became more formalized after the 1600s when the samurai class, which is basically the equivalent to the knightly class of the Christian West, right? They they were faced with how to live in a period of peace and how to bring these virtues forward to lead, to guide, to mentor, to teach, and all of that
Mm-hmm.
sort of stuff. So anyway, the premise of the book, therefore, is what is a code of virtue for a world on a new socioeconomic standard? Like, how do we? So if the current fiat standard requires that people lie, cheat, steal, politic their way, parasite their way into resources, like if that's the modus operandi, if that's the MO of the fiat standard, what is the MO? What is the code of being? What is the playbook for succeeding on a Bitcoin standard?
Mm-hmm.
And the the book sort of took a life of its own. Like I wrote the damn thing 8 times, and like
Wow.
yeah, I took 2 years. The thing's a beast. It's like 530 pages, 3 pounds. Like
Is that because as you started this book, even your own personal understanding of what a code of ethics or what a code of morality almost is what I want to call it in and around a open source, completely transparent financial ecosystem looks like? Is that because you continue to learn and your own understanding evolved, or was it just like rewrites or something along those lines?
no, it's because I evolved as a person. So initially, the premise of the book was to look at what were the emergent virtues among Bitcoiners, and a lot of people still think that's what the book is about, but it's not. The book changed in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that I said, okay, what were the virtues that were upstream of the greatest cultures, that were upstream of the greatest civilizations on earth, and how can we draw from that and project forward? So it was less about the emergent virtues of a Bitcoin standard and all this sort of stuff. In fact, what I found on
Mm-hmm.
my journey was that Bitcoiners are actually not as special as I thought. In fact, I found there's this sort of whole thing about Bitcoin fixes you and all this sort of stuff, which I actually found to be false, which is a big eye opener for me. I was under this sort of impression. I was convinced that, Bitcoin fixes civilization because it fixes the individual, it lowers their time preference and all this sort of stuff. But what I realized
Right.
actually
Fix the
was
money,
that,
fix the world. Right.
yeah, exactly. And I found that to be only partially true. Once again, it's kind of similar to the hijacking conversation that we had. Is that it's not false, but it's not true either. It's somewhere in
Hmm.
between. And what I found is that the people who, I mean, in fact, the majority of people who end up finding Bitcoin and getting rich out of it turn out to be scumbags. There's a small minority who turn out to be sort of like the kind of person who wants to lower his time preference, who wants to build a family, who wants to build something for the future and all that sort of stuff. That's actually a minority of Bitcoiners. But the minority of Bitcoiners that is already had a predisposition for a low time preference,
Hmm.
for high quality virtues, for being an ethical, moral person, etc. So it wasn't that Bitcoin fixed them. Bitcoin sort of gave them an opportunity to get ahead and to unlock predispositions that they already had. So this is a very important distinction because it kind of it falsifies the claim that Bitcoin fixes everything or Bitcoin fixes
Hmm.
this. It shows that there's something else. There's an element of nature in human beings that can potentially be unlocked. Now, to tie that into where the book ended up was I talk about Bitcoin as a framework for excellence, which is in this new framework, on this new socioeconomic standard, which kind of person wins? Is it the parasite or is it the person with the predisposition for these greater, more ethical virtues and morals? And my argument is that it's that person. And if you double down on these 10 virtues, so justice, courage, compassion, honesty, um, responsibility, excellence, loyalty, respect, and self control. That's the 10. If you double down on those virtues, you will, in my opinion, succeed on a socioeconomic standard that is harder to commit fraud and lie and do
Hmm.
all that sort of stuff in, right? So that's sort of like the thread. And yeah, man, I ask a bunch of very difficult questions in there for Bitcoiners because I was asking them for myself. Like I ask questions like, does wealth corrupt? Like, are we doomed to ultimately fail when we get wealthy? Because it seems that every great civilization in the past, the wealthier it got, the more corrupt it got. Like, Rome,
Yep.
there's this saying is that Rome used to fight with iron. And then when it came to fight with gold, it fell apart, right? Because Rome thought that you could buy virtue. Rome thought that you could buy courage, that you could buy all of these qualities towards the end, right? The Roman senators, whereas the Roman founders and the early emperors, etc., they knew that you could not buy any of those things. It wasn't gold. It wasn't like virtue is not monetary in nature. There's something higher. So anyway, there's a lot of discussion about these sort of really hard topics. But with the sort of the undertone of what are the virtues, and I use code of virtue very specifically instead of moral code because I don't profess to tell people what morality is. Like if you want to study morality, like go read the Bible or something like that. Like there's
Hmm.
you find morality there. I'm not here to pretend to be Jesus or a priest or a saint or anything like that. What I did was I looked at the commonality amongst the great civilizations, as I said. So there was, the Japanese built a great civilization, and their warrior class established these virtues. The Christian West did the same thing. And if you look at the virtues of chivalry and Bushido, they're basically the same thing, even though they were developed in two different parts of the world by two completely different people. Um, with different genetics, different biology, different DNA. So something about that makes a lot of sense. And if you look at those virtues, they also map to the Greeks, the Romans, the other great
Hmm.
civilizations. So to me, there was something there, and that's the thread that I pulled on. That's the weaving that I pulled on. So it's a book on history. It's a book on philosophy. It's a book on ethics. It's a book on virtue. It's a book to challenge the shit out of people's preconceptions about whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's society, whether it's culture, all of these things. So I promise it's a very unique Bitcoin book. I shouldn't even call it a Bitcoin book. Sometimes I wonder why I I use the word Bitcoin in there because I don't really like. There's not a lot
Oh,
of.
so it's actually kind of fascinating that you did, because it sounded like it began as something targeting maybe not necessarily the Bitcoin community, but was to be a critique of the Bitcoin community and maybe where you foresaw the Bitcoin community could one day go. And then it ends up sounding like it ended up becoming like this fascinating study of virtue throughout multiple civilizations, throughout multiple stages of history, and then trying to take the lessons learned, at least by paraphrasing, I'm guessing, taking the lessons learned from how these civilizations either thrived or inevitably declined, as every civilization does, and applied it to Bitcoin. So, I mean, do you see as Bitcoin becomes this ultimate tool of wealth? I mean, I do think that in our lifetime, we're going to see it surpass gold's market cap. I think that that's probably an
Yeah,
inevitability, right?
yeah, yeah. That's it.
Um, do we think that that corrupts the Bitcoin community, or rather that there are players that are more easily corruptible, such as nation states and financial institutions that we've seen now get involved in the Bitcoin network? Do we think that Bitcoin becomes a potential tool that they can manipulate for their own gain in their own ultimate corruption game?
No, I mean, I'm still pretty. I'm cautiously optimistic about Bitcoin corrupting them, not them corrupting Bitcoin. I think that sort of interplay will obviously be happening.
Hmm.
But I get the sense that Bitcoin is still more robust. I kind of make the case that uh, Bitcoin as a framework for excellence will move civilization back towards a more uh, conscious and clear type of feudalism. So I think
Mm.
feudalism is the only way in which civilization has ever existed. We have feudalism today, but it's very uh, unconscious kind of feudalism. It's a very hidden
It's
version.
unequivocally true that that is the case. I mean, all you have to do is just look at how easy it is for elections to effectively be bought, and we've seen that over the last. Yeah, we've seen that in my entire lifetime. It's feudalism. The masses are easily manipulated. It's unfortunate, but that's just the way that it works.
And the thing is, we've been encouraged to think of feudalism as a bad word or a bad thing, but I don't think it is. I think it's perfectly fine. We've been brainwashed into thinking it's bad so that we can open the mind to a stupidity like democracy, for example, and all of this sort of thing, which in my opinion is far worse for the prosperity of a civilization. So with that being said, like I talk a little bit in there about like Bitcoin feudalism and how we will one day once again see the rise of powerful sovereign families. For example, we'll see the rise of kings and queens again, who have a vested interest in their territory and extending the quality and lifespan of what they build in their territory and family, which I think is once again it's much more natural. It's been the way civilization has been built forever, right? Like we've always had that kind of thing. Like
Right.
even down to the animal kingdom, there is the monarchy and the aristocracy in an animal kingdom. It's like it's far more natural. We've just kind of distorted it a little bit. The republic of, or at least the early republic of what America was a good example of something that was very close to a monarchy type setup.
Hmm.
But even that's been distorted. That's been turned into much more of a democracy, which is a
I mean, the
which is a
founding fathers even thought maybe they would start it as a monarchy, right? I mean, George Washington was supposed to be a everything but in name king.
Mhm, 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 mhm. It it may have avoided the scepter of democracy for longer. Who knows? But yeah. Anyway, that's like I think Bitcoin will change the socioeconomic foundation. That's why kind of the subtitle of the book. If I grab it here, it says a code of virtue for a world on a new economic standard. And in the book, I say a little bit more broadly, a new socioeconomic standard, because
Hmm.
that's the premise here is like it's less that I'm interested in Bitcoin itself, it's that Bitcoin represents a new socioeconomic standard, and as a result there's a new playbook that we need for it.
It's interesting how you phrase it that way, because I mean, Bitcoin itself obviously is rooted in the cypherpunk era. I would probably say that most people that identified with Bitcoin early on were libertarians, right? And a lot of them believed in this. I mean, I'm a libertarian myself, and a lot of them believed in this because they felt that if you're able to fix the money, you fix the world, blah, blah, blah. Creates a new socioeconomic paradigm that could inevitably lead to the fall of the concept of a nation state. I don't think that that's reasonable, but there's a lot of Bitcoiners out there. I mean, you have the Liberland thing. I actually met the guy in Abu Dhabi a couple of weeks ago. Um, but you're kind of flipping that on its head and saying that no, that's actually not going to be the case. It's not going to necessarily see the end of the nation state, but this new socioeconomic paradigm is going to see the rise of a new feudal state. We're not going to call it a feudal state for political purposes, obviously, but it's going to effectively create. I mean, would it be inaccurate to say that you view this as it's going to create the Rothschilds, the Carnegies, the Mellons? Fast forward a couple of years, it's the Gates, the Elon Musks of the Bitcoin world. And they're effectively going to have their own little nations or collective that they're effectively charged with protecting. Is that kind of an accurate way to say that you see this going?
Yeah, I think so. And that'll trigger a lot of people and be like, oh, because the Rothschilds and all these people are evil and all that sort of stuff. I think my premise is that Bitcoiners are going to become disproportionately wealthy, and unless there is some push to establish this code of virtue, kind of remember similar to the samurai had all of the military power in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So unless they established this way of being, what was going to stop them from just going and fucking killing everybody, right? Like, and so they needed to develop this way of being functional white blood cells, right? And the same thing is the people that are going to have all of this wealth and resources, like they're going to have to cultivate some level of nobility. Like the essence or the true definition of nobility is not snobbery, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
noblesse oblige as a concept was that you almost like a father to the people that depend on you, that you provide for, right? And that doesn't mean just like alms and charity. That means like if you're a owner of the land, the owner of the business, the owner of the industry, the owner of the product or service or whatever, right? Like you have a responsibility. Like nobility and wealth comes with responsibility to provide, to give, to help, to lead, to direct, to do all that sort of stuff. So, there needs to be, once again, like a code of things, of virtues that are valuable and virtues that we live by for this new class of elite.
No, so it sounds like I think your next book, you're going to have to write a comic book. With great Bitcoin wealth comes great responsibility. Maybe have a little Bitcoin Spider-Man or something like that there, right? And I love that. I love that vision that you have, because I think my hope would be is that if we're in a more open, more transparent socioeconomic ecosystem, we no longer have the asymmetric information that currently exists in today's capital markets. Therefore, people can be more informed, people can be more empowered, but you're still going to have a divide of wealth. Of course, the early Bitcoiners are the ones that have been stacking sats for so long. They're going to be the heads of these feudal states, as you call them. But I wonder if it will end up being a more natural financial system than maybe what we currently have, and certainly a less corrupted one, just because of how transparent a Bitcoin standard would be. And so I hypothesize that with the advent of Bitcoin layer twos, that we will see tokenization, and we already do see elements of tokenization happening on the Bitcoin core network, of course. But I wonder if we start to see genuine equities and derivatives, debts, bonds, etc., effectively trading on Bitcoin. Bitcoin effectively becomes the CSD, the settlement layer for all financial commerce, if you will. And of course, it still is there for payments. You'll have layer twos like the Lightning Network, etc. I wonder if in that world, because I think the main reason people hear feudalism and they think of it being a bad thing is because they view the serfs in the feudal system as effectively slaves in everything but name. And I think there's an element of truth to that, depending on whichever fiefdom you are maybe from. But in this open and transparent ecosystem, you're not necessarily going to be a serf in the way that historically we might think of a feudal system, but rather you're still going to have your own sovereignty, your own independence, your own liberty. Um, I don't know. Maybe I have to think through this significantly further to see maybe where your worldview.
Let me pull on a few threads then. Let me pull on a few threads. So one thing I'll say before I forget, that I ended up finishing the book with a story actually,
Mhm.
called "The Sovereign Cross," and it's a story set in the year 2084, where you have this network of what I call executive states. Before you were talking about like, what do we call these states? Nation states. What do we call them? Not feudal states. So I came up with this name called executive states, which are basically territories run by CEO kings. Effectively, that's kind of like, imagine
Mhm.
Bukele meets Elon Musk. That's the kind of character that would be at the head of a state that would function like an executive state. And these things function on Bitcoin, and all of the economically associated or financial associated stuff runs on Bitcoin. So I talk a little bit in there about like how things are, you know, everything from equities to all that sort of stuff is now settled on chain, and everything is done
Mhm.
there. So we're definitely aligned there. So that story like kind of ends the book and kind of takes all of the concepts that I've tried to write about in abstract and kind of paints a picture or a vision of what that might look like. And I set like the protagonist, the macro protagonist is the executive state, and the macro antagonist is the old world UN, right? So it's set in
Right.
old Brussels. It's like become this big blob, the capital of Eurabia. So I kind of like play around with all that sort of stuff. So
That's
anyway,
interesting. I like that.
so that aside, um, your your question earlier, where you were sort of like playing with, okay, the serfs and this and that, and who does what. the The challenge with serfdom is that it's very hard to get away from it, because there is like, no matter what freedoms you give people, if you go and give all of the people the vote, for example, which we did thinking that we were going to pull people out of serfdom, people
Mhm.
just sort of like the serf class, that class of person just finds a new form of slavery. They enslave themselves to food, to TV, to Netflix, to the mainstream media, to seed
To
oil,
debt
whatever.
into their salary.
Yeah, exactly, right. So they
Yeah.
become wage slaves, and they become, media slaves and whatever. So it's very hard to unslave or unserf serfs. If anything, and this is a whole rabbit hole, is like, one could make the argument that the serfs of the Middle Ages and feudal era had more freedom and autonomy than do the serfs or the standard citizens of the modern era, right? Like, the standard citizens in the modern era are commuting 2-3 hours a day on
Mhm.
average back and forth to work. They spend all their time in a fucking fluorescent office where they don't get to touch nature or anything like that. Then in the evening, they sit there staring at a fucking box on Netflix, and they sort of have this like whole artificial life. Whereas the serf of past only worked 2 or 3 days a week. Every other day was a holiday and a feast, and they, plowed the lands and all this sort of stuff. But, sure, they paid some amount of what they produced on their lord's lands to the lord, but they always had enough to eat. They always had feasts. So like, now again,
But
as you said,
doesn't that sound familiar? It's like we're paying something now that's maybe arguably theft.
but the thing is, now it's more like 50, 60, 70, 80% of your amount that you produce, whereas back then it might have been like 10 or 20%, right? Like, so
Right.
so the percentages are way more now. So anyway, again, like you said, these things aren't clear cut, and it was probably different from fiefdom to fiefdom, from territory to territory, right? And the poor rulers, the ones that were really bad at leading their people and caring for their people, those without nobility and noblesse oblige, they would probably turn that existence of the serfs into something that resembled slavery, whereas
Mhm.
the good lords, the ones who managed to create prosperity on their lands and everything, treated their serfs with respect, with dignity, with noblesse oblige. And in my opinion, those were the territories that became more prosperous, more wealthy, more strong, more stable, because you had a like some level of unity. You had
Mhm.
an ethnos, right, amongst the people, and you had a this is where the genesis of
Incentives were aligned is the easiest way to phrase it, right?
far more, exactly. Incentives were aligned, and it wasn't just economic incentives. It was sort of like cultural and ethical incentives. Like they were a people versus these are my subjects, right? There was some level of difference there, and in many ways, it would have been. I mean, not in many ways. It is categorically immoral, for example, to take someone who was a serf and
Hmm.
put them into battle next to a knight, right? Because the knight was psychologically, emotionally, physically, he was a different person, and his role was to go and fight, whereas the serf's role was to go and till the land, and they were very different, but they both played their roles. Kind of like in the human body, you have red blood cells for a reason, you have white blood cells for a reason. You don't ask the white blood cells to do what the red blood cells do, and
Right.
out of this every man should get a vote kind of stupidity, right? There's a difference between the roles we all play, and the most functional structures work like this. I mean, a company is a feudal system.
Yeah.
Like a company is feudal by nature. There is the CEO; he makes the decisions. There is a board that he's accountable towards. There is a management team. There is minimum, like these structures of efficient because they work. And when we go against this because of some stupid label that's been given, oh, feudalism is bad and it's evil, and everyone should get a vote and all this sort of stuff, we end up deviating from what's natural and from what works, and then we have the destruction of civilization. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of things to go through there, and this is like the thinking that I think is lacking in a lot of the Bitcoin space.
So I think that's absolutely fascinating that you've been able to articulate that, because it's not something that I've ever really dived too much into. But one thought experiment I would like to play before we have to jump off here is, so the antithesis of Bitcoin, at least I believe, would be a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. And so if you were to ask me if Kamala Harris got elected versus Donald Trump, I would say that there would probably be slightly more than a 50% chance that we would inevitably see a CBDC in the United States and therefore the rest of the world. And with Donald Trump now elected, I think there's less than a 50% chance that we'll see a CBDC, therefore, throughout the rest of the world. For better or for worse, and this is maybe just my American egotism, the world largely follows America's lead. That's just the truth of it. And they're doing it with the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve right now. I mean, Donald Trump says he wants to do it. Okay, fine. Bukele was first. Very good kudos to him. But everyone kind of thought he was a laughing stock for 2 or 3 years after he announces that. But now Trump does it, and everybody takes it seriously, right? Even in European Parliament, just yesterday they were talking about it. The German Bundestag, after they sold something like 2.5 billion in Bitcoin, now they're talking about buying the shit back, right? But a thought experiment there, because I do think that a CBDC is still a genuine threat. And I do think that the CBDC is the end all be all of financial tyranny. We are in true 1984 if we get a CBDC. Even we're pretty close to it already, but that's the end game. If that happens, game over. It's 1984. That the world that you just painted right there, that feudal world, does look to a certain extent similar, instead of being done under corporate fiefdoms, being done under nation states with the CBDC, right? And maybe there would be more economic liberties and freedoms, but the thought experiment I'd like to play with you is what happens in that future world, that story that you tell, if instead of it being Bitcoin, it's a CBDC.
Well, my my answer to that is both happen, and that's why in the book the way I set the
Ah,
story the way I set the story up was that the old world UN was on a CBDC and these executive states were on Bitcoin, and then I showed the difference with the main character in there is someone who lives in the new executive states, who was originally from the UN but escaped, and he's basically like smuggling goods back into the UN.
so
And lo and
where's the metaphorical Berlin Wall in this world that you've created here? I mean, I love world building. Like, you're creating like the George RRM version of the future Bitcoin ethos, right? You've created Bitcoin Westeros. So where's the Berlin Wall in this CBDC Bitcoin divide?
I don't specify where it is, but because I would need a much larger story to like really paint the broader picture. So this is only a short story. It's like a taster for what I might take some time over the next couple of years and actually turn this into a whole series of
This
stories.
should be a fiction novel. Like
It totally
this
should.
is
Yeah.
brilliant.
Yeah, it totally should. So I have that intention over the coming years, but I place it vaguely somewhere between Brussels and the Balkans, somewhere in that range.
Ah, interesting. I mean, and then of course, is there a similar divide in North America?
Yeah. So I talk about how the free state of Texas splits, and then you've got this kind of aggregate of I can't remember the name I gave them, but basically it's kind of like the Democratic Union of the United States or something like that, and that's kind of like a mixture of Washington State and a couple of the sort of the northeastern, like California splits, etc. And that's sort of
Mhm.
the grouping that they create. And then you have like these sort of more sovereign elements of the United States, and these kind of executive states end up in partnership. So there's like the Free State of Texas and Singapore and Dubai and um, New Macedonia and El Salvador, etc. They're part of this network of states who have a relationship that is underpinned by their shared economic interest in Bitcoin. So there's like that's kind of like the world that I try to build out of that. But to your earlier question, I think we do end up in a situation where we have both, and the line that divides the more, call it, group of sovereign individuals versus the group of lemmings is going to be the Bitcoin CBDC line.
I mean, that's a fascinating thought experiment. I'm really happy that we did that. And I absolutely now have to go pick up your book because I need that as, I mean, your book that you've written here basically sounds like it's going to be the foreword to your own fantasy epic set in 2084 about how the world looks like operating on two separate and alternative financial ecosystems. Alex, this was one of the absolute best conversations I've had in Bitcoin in some time. I really appreciate you for coming on the Proof of Words podcast and talking about your book. We did want to talk about Satlantis, but unfortunately, we got so far down the rabbit hole on this. We're going to have to bring you back again sometime in the near future because I'm fascinated by Nostr. I took a look at Satlantis. It looks absolutely incredible. For how much I travel, I think I'm going to have to become a client starting right away.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you. And yeah, we've always got next year. Like Satlantis still has a lot of work to do, as does Nostra. So we'll definitely have time to chat about that next year.
I really appreciate it. Thank you again for joining us.